All right, folks. About time to wrap this up. This will be the second of two lectures for the gender of violence. And so we're going to continue looking at violence as an institutional problem. The book points to seeing this through the lens of political leaders in the United States, especially presidents. Um, this idea of manliness and manhood represented in leadership. President Johnson, of course, this was one of his great flaws. He saw in many respects, his manhood in relationship to the Vietnam War. And he would say things like, I didn't just screw Ho Chi Minh, I cut his pecker off. As if he was emasculating or stealing Ho Chi Minh's manhood away from him, and therefore stealing the manhood away from the Viet Cong. Of course, President Carter was seen as less of a manly leader, mostly because his reluctance to intervene in Iran. He was seen as weak. Many consider that the defining characteristic that lost him the presidency to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is the quintessential gunslinger, the manly man. In the 1980s, what the United States was looking for was John Wayne, but John Wayne was no longer available, and we got Ronald the Reagan. And Reagan really used this tough guys, this masculine pose to intimidate world leaders. George Herbert Walker Bush existed somewhere in between, even though he was a former military individual and head of the CIA. He didn't take as much of a tough guy's position as Reagan did, but he also said to Saddam Hussein, I will draw a line in the sand, and if you cross it, you will pay. Of course, President Clinton, he originally was seen as more of a passive president, and we saw his popularity rise when he undertook airstrikes in Iraq. So when a president uses the bully pulpit to transmit this tough guise, it's impacting. We saw the same from George Walker Bush in his attack on Iraq post 9/11. Obama was seen as a much more passive president, was more willing to use diplomacy than military action, and his popularity suffered in some respects because of that. And of course, one can't look past Donald Trump. That is all of this man is bellicose, chest pounding, chest pumping, fist pumping, saber rattling, essentially calling people names, using bully tactics that you would see normally on a playground. Donald Trump thinks that he needs to use that as a way to intimidate other world leaders and anyone that disagrees with him. We've never seen this type of just tough guys for no reason whatsoever, like we're seeing with Donald Trump. We also need to talk about violence in relationships. intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and dating violence can and does impact all people, regardless of sex, gender, or sexuality. This chart really maps that out. As far as bisexual women are concerned, 46.1% of them say they've been raped versus 13.1% of lesbians and 17.4% of heterosexual women. Those numbers for bisexual women, and I'm not quite sure why they exist for bisexual women like they do, but they spike in every category. Rape, sexual violence, stalking, and intimate partner violence. And you take those same numbers and you compare them to men. And this is where you see the differences. Bisexual men, there's not enough of a sample size to make statements about who is and who is not getting raped. Same with gay men. What we see as sexual violence for gay men is, or bisexual men, higher than gay men and higher than heterosexual men, all of which are lower than the numbers for women. Intimate partner violence, bisexual men 37.3%, 26 and 29. All of this stuff happens less to men than it does women, no matter what your gender preference is. What we know about rape-prone societies, the lower the status of women, the higher the rape rate. So if you have great polarity between what women and men are in a society, and you value men over women, then you can almost guarantee that you're going to see increased rape rates compared to societies that have more of an equal approach to men and women. Levels of militarism, ideology of male toughness, violence in general, things like distant father-child relationships, they also play into whether you're going to live in a rape-prone society. And of course, low women's autonomy and low levels of men involved in child rearing. All of this is predictable in chapter 14 of the gender class. The greater the equality women have in a society, the less violence that is brought to them, whether that violence is physical abuse, sexual violence, rape, or murder. The more polarized the socialization process is, especially in reference to men being dominant, women being subordinate, the higher levels these the amounts of this violence that's brought to women is going to be. We have to remember that violence, rape, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, murder, it's not about sex. It's about power. And it's about who has that power. Or has it been taken away in other contexts? So as women gain more power in society, which ultimately threatens man's position as the dominant, you're going to see more sexual violence and physical abuse brought to women. Because men who abuse women are potentially trying to restore something that they've lost. And often you hear men who are trying to justify raping or sexually harassing or sexually abusing a woman by saying she deserved it. Well, how dare she think that she's better than me? How dare she push off my attempts to court her or show I was interested in her. And in the end, men are just trying to, in their own mind, trying to right the ship. And those who abuse same-sex partners, you have a very minor portion of this population is due to stress, but we also know that those who are in same-sex partner relationships tend to experience violence from heterosexuals more so than they do from their same-sex partners, even though it does exist. So what can we conclude? Well, we can do far better in reducing women's violence in our society by withdrawing our tacit, silent, and thereby complicit support for it. We need not rely on biological explanations, which are evasive and reductionist. We need not male bash either. Ultimately, we transform the meaning of masculinity, and by doing so, we will produce less violent boys and men, and less tragic consequences that are associated with those violent boys and men. As I was saying, as I tend to say, violence against women is not a women's problem per se. It is a man's problem. Now, I say per se because the violence is being brought to women, therefore it is their problem. They have to deal with the after effects, the consequences of a male being violent to them. But it's overwhelmingly males that are engaging in the violence itself. Therefore, if we're going to reduce violence against women, then males need to get on the bus. They need to stop being complicit and supporting or just turning a blind eye to sexist statements, to people who you know are engaging in this type of behavior, but they're your buddies and you don't want to confront them on it. This is a male issue, and it's not going to go away unless males start policing it. And until we do that, we're going to be in this very similar position where we're embarrassed by the amounts of sexual harassment, sexual violence that's being brought against women. This is particularly important right now as we're seeing just whether it's Harvey Weinstein, as I said earlier, or Kevin Spacey, or Roy Moore, the prospective senator from Alabama, or Donald Trump, the president of the United States. These people have used their positions of power to sexually harass and sexually assault women and men. And we've allowed for it to happen. We literally elected a president of the United States who was a outright sexist. He stated what you could do with women because he was what he could do with women because he was in a position of power. He could do anything he wanted to them. And until we as a society start saying no more, things are not going to change.